In the quaint, fog-enshrouded village of Eldermore, isolated by dense forests and treacherous mountains, the arrival of autumn brought not only the crisp air but also whispered fears. Eldermore was ancient, a place where stories clung like ivy to the stones of each cottage and wept from the gnarled branches of towering, leafless trees. Here, the darkness felt sentient, and the nights were restless. The story begins with Clara, a young librarian who recently moved to Eldermore, drawn by a mysterious inheritance from an aunt she never knew. The inheritance was an old, sprawling manor at the edge of the village, shrouded in ivy and secrecy. The villagers spoke little of it, and when they did, their words were hushed, their glances filled with dread. Clara, fascinated by folklore, discovered her aunt's extensive collection of ancient books and manuscripts about Eldermore's history. Among these was a peculiar, leather-bound volume, unnamed, with pages as black as pitch. The text appeared only under the moonlight, written in a shimmering, silver ink. It spoke of a forgotten time when Eldermore was cursed by a shadow that fell over it, consuming the light and the minds of its inhabitants. The shadow was said to be born from the darkest human emotions and fed on fear and despair. As autumn deepened, and the nights grew longer, Clara noticed the villagers becoming increasingly agitated. Animals were found mutilated in the woods, strange symbols appeared carved into the trees, and whispers of the shadow began to circulate with renewed fervor. Compelled to understand more, Clara visited the local historian, an old man named Edgar, who lived alone surrounded by ancient tomes and artifacts. Edgar revealed that every century, the shadow sought to cross into their world, and its gateway was always the same, the manor that Clara had inherited. He spoke of a ritual, performed by the village's founding families, that kept the shadow at bay, a ritual forgotten as generations passed and skepticism replaced superstition. The historian handed Clara an old, tattered map leading to a hidden chamber beneath the manor, where the ritual was to be performed. But, he warned, the shadow was cunning and would try to stop her, using her deepest fears against her. That night, as a storm lashed against Eldermore, Clara, driven by a desperate need to protect her new home, descended into the bowels of the manor. The chamber was a hollow echo of ancient rites, its walls carved with runes that pulsed faintly in the flickering light of Clara's lantern. In the center lay a stone altar, stained with the passage of time, and around it, a circle of black stones that seemed to absorb the light around them. Clara, heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve, began the ritual as outlined in her aunt's book. However, as the ritual progressed, the air grew oppressively thick, shadows twisting and writhing against the stone walls as if trying to break free. Then, the unthinkable happened. Clara's lantern flickered and died, plunging her into suffocating darkness. Whispers filled the chamber, each one voicing Clara's deepest insecurities and darkest memories. Outside, the village of Eldermore trembled under the weight of an unnatural darkness, and from the depths of the forest, Red Eyes watched, waiting. The ground beneath the village began to tremble as if the very earth anticipated the shadow's rise. As the earth beneath Eldermore shook with the growing power of the unseen, Clara fought against the enveloping dread. Her breaths came short and sharp, each exhale visible in the chilling air of the underground chamber. The whispers grew louder, morphing into distinct voices, voices of the villagers, past and present, all distorted by terror and malice. Clara scrambled in the dark, her hands searching for the lantern. Her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the stone altar, sending a shiver up her spine. As she fumbled with the lantern, the whispers converged into a single, chilling command: cease. Ignoring the voices, Clara managed to relight the lantern. Its frail light flickered, casting long, sinister shadows that danced across the walls. She turned her attention back to the ritual. The book had specified an offering, something personal, something that had witnessed her deepest fears. With trembling hands, she pulled out a small, worn photograph of her and her parents, taken before their untimely deaths, a memory that haunted her, laden with unresolved grief. As she placed the photograph on the altar, the ground trembled more violently, a deep growl echoing up through the fissures forming in the earthen floor. The black stones around the altar began to glow faintly with a phosphorescent light, casting ghastly hues over the photograph, which seemed to absorb the eerie glow. Outside, the villagers huddled in their homes, sensing the escalation of the unseen threat. Lights flickered as if the very energy of Eldermore was being siphoned into the manor's ancient foundation. In their homes, families drew closer, whispering prayers and casting salt circles, feeble protections against the encroaching darkness. Meanwhile, Edgar, having given Clara the map, felt a surge of responsibility and fear for the young woman alone in the manor. He left his home, clutching a lantern and a satchel filled with old talismans and protective amulets, and made his way towards the manor. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches as if trying to block his path with their gnarled fingers. Back in the chamber, Clara recited the incantations, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Each word resonated in the confined space, amplified by the ancient acoustics of the room. The black stones pulsed faster, their glow intensifying with each line of the ritual. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing scream cut through the night, halting Clara's recitation. It came from above, somewhere within the manor. Her heart raced, fear urging her to flee, but the weight of her duty anchored her. She knew she couldn't abandon the ritual, not when it was perhaps the only barrier between the shadow and the world. With a deep, steadying breath, Clara resumed the incantations, her voice now a defiant shout against the cacophony of groans and cracks from the manor's structure. The walls of the chamber vibrated, dust and small stones falling like rain from the ceiling. Edgar, approaching the manor, saw the windows aglow with an unnatural light, and the trees around the building thrashed as if in the grip of an angry storm. Pushing against the wind, he reached the front door, his old bones protesting the effort. He paused, feeling the ominous energy seeping from the cracks in the door, and with a whispered prayer, he pushed it open. Inside, the manor was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Edgar moved as quickly as his old legs would allow, heading towards the cellar door, the map's path etched in his mind. The house groaned around him, the air thick with the scent of mold and the electric charge of impending doom. Part 3. Edgar descended into the cellar, each step echoing ominously in the tight space. The air grew colder as he moved deeper, his breath visible in the lantern light. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls, moving just at the edge of his vision, making him turn back repeatedly only to find nothing. He could hear Clara's distant chants, a beacon guiding him through the dark. Above ground, the storm that had begun as natural turned otherworldly. Lightning cracked with an unnatural frequency, each flash illuminating the sky with a sickly green light, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The wind carried voices, not just howls of wind but murmurs and screams of past sufferers of the village, all swirling around the shaken homes. In the ritual chamber, Clara's voice grew hoarse as she continued the incantations. The glow from the stones intensified, now a deep, blood red, pulsing in rhythm with her quickening heartbeat. The photograph on the altar began to curl at the edges, the faces of her parents distorting as if in pain. Clara's resolve wavered as she watched, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice did not falter. She knew too much depended on her. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped her shoulder. Clara spun around, lantern swinging wildly, casting erratic shadows. Edgar stood there, his face etched with worry. "Clara! You must finish the ritual," he shouted over the roar that filled the chamber. Clara nodded, turning back to the altar, her resolve hardened by Edgar's presence. Together, they recited the final stanzas of the ritual. The ground shook more violently, a sign that the shadow was close to breaking through, its fury at being thwarted palpable in the trembling earth. Outside, the villagers felt the climax of the struggle. The air felt charged, electric, as if the atmosphere itself bristled with anticipation. In their homes, families clung to each other, eyes closed against the horrors their imaginations conjured. In the chamber, as Clara and Edgar spoke the last word of the ritual, a deafening silence fell. The shaking stopped abruptly, the red light from the stones extinguished as if snuffed out by an unseen force. Darkness enveloped them, complete and absolute. Clara's lantern flickered one final time before going out, leaving them in an oppressive blackness. Their eyes slowly adjusted, and they realized the chamber was no longer just a room carved from stone but appeared to be a part of a larger, unknown space. The walls seemed to have receded into an impenetrable darkness that their senses told them was vast and empty, yet felt full of watchful, malevolent presences. Edgar reached into his satchel, pulling out a small, ancient oil lamp. He lit it with a trembling hand, the old wick catching slowly. The light it cast was meager but enough to reveal that the black stones of the ritual circle were now cracked, their surfaces a spiderweb of fissures. "We must leave, now," Edgar whispered, his voice quivering with urgency. "It's not safe here anymore." They turned to leave, but as they did, a chilling breeze swept through the chamber. The air carried a whisper, not just a sound but a palpable feeling of malice and promise of return. Soon, it hissed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. As Clara and Edgar hurried back through the tunnels leading to the manor, the weight of the unseen gaze followed them, a reminder that their actions this night had perhaps only postponed a darker future. As they emerged into the stormy night, the air still charged with a foreboding energy, they looked back at the manor, its silhouette a dark monument against the storm-tossed sky. Part 4. Clara and Edgar, their hearts pounding, made their way from the manor as swiftly as the tempestuous night would allow. Each crack of thunder felt like a dire warning, a sonic boom underscoring their precarious escape from the Shadow's domain. The rain lashed at them, driven by gales that seemed to carry the cold fingers of the forgotten dead, tugging at their clothes, whispering for them to return. They reached Edgar's house, a small, sturdy cottage filled with relics and books that spoke of many lifetimes. Clara's eyes darted around the room, seeing the walls lined with talismans and symbols of protection. It felt like a sanctuary, albeit a temporary one, from the horrors they had left behind at the manor. Edgar stoked the fire, casting a warm, reassuring light in the room but doing little to thaw the chill that had settled deep in their bones. "We've only bought some time," he said gravely, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. The ritual was supposed to banish it, not anger it. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping on hot tea that barely touched the cold dread inside her. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and fatigue. "The shadow has been bound to Eldermore for centuries. It's part of the land, part of the very fabric of this place. But every binding has its limits, and every seal can be broken," Edgar explained, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "We need to find out how to strengthen the seal or eventually, it will come back, stronger." "But how?" "The book didn't say anything about what to do if the ritual failed," Clara said, frustration and worry knitting her brow. "We need to delve deeper into the village's past. There's more to Eldermore's history, things lost or perhaps hidden for reasons we must uncover." Edgar's gaze drifted to his extensive library, a treasure trove of forgotten lore. The storm outside seemed to be listening, its howls intensifying as if angry at their plans to thwart its dark intentions. The night grew darker, the moon obscured by swirling, unnatural clouds, casting the world into an abyssal darkness punctuated only by the occasional violent silver of lightning. As the night deepened, Edgar pulled out several old, dusty tomes from his collection. They sat down together, the old wooden table between them groaning under the weight of leather-bound books filled with arcane knowledge. They pored over the texts, searching for any mention of the shadow or rituals associated with it. Hours passed, the only sounds in the room the crackling of the fire, the turn of pages, and the storm's relentless assault against the little cottage. Finally, Clara's finger stopped on a page, her eyes widening. "Here," she said, pointing to a faded illustration of a similar ritual circle, but with different symbols and a second circle surrounding the first. "It looks like a secondary binding, a failsafe." Ah, yes, Edgar leaned closer, squinting at the fine print beneath the illustration. This speaks of a circle of return, used to reinforce the primary binding. But it requires, oh dear, it requires a relic of immense power, lost decades ago. The relic, as the tome detailed, was a crystal of pure obsidian, said to be the heart of the forests surrounding Eldermore, imbued with the essence of the land and its history. According to legend, it was stolen, lost to the greed of outsiders who did not understand its significance or the delicate balance it maintained. "We need to find it," Clara declared, a new resolve hardening her features. Her eyes, though shadowed by fatigue, burned with a fierce determination. "Yes, and soon," Edgar agreed, closing the tome with a sense of finality. "We must prepare. The shadow will not remain dormant for long, especially now that it's been provoked." Outside, as if to punctuate Edgar's words, a louder, more desperate wind battered the village, shaking the windows and howling with renewed fury. The storm, like the shadow, seemed to promise that it was far from over. Part 5. In the early hours before dawn, with the storm still raging outside, Clara and Edgar equipped themselves for what would undoubtedly be a perilous journey. Edgar, with his extensive knowledge of the land and its lore, gathered old maps and scribbled notes on potential locations where the obsidian crystal could be hidden. Clara, her resolve steeled by the urgent need to protect Eldermore, prepared practical supplies, food, water, torches, and other essentials. The storm, as if aware of their intentions, seemed to roar in defiance, the winds shaking the very foundation of Edgar's cottage. They could hear the creaks and groans of the old wood, protesting against the force that besieged it. It was an ominous soundtrack to their preparations, a reminder of the shadow's pervasive reach. As the first light of dawn broke, the storm inexplicably abated, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and something faintly acrid, like the after-smell of lightning strikes. The sky was awash of gray, the clouds heavy and low, threatening more rain or worse. With Edgar leading, they set out towards the dense forest that bordered Eldermore. The forest was old, much older than the village, its trees towering and twisted, their branches interlocking to form a dark canopy that barely allowed any light to penetrate. The ground was a carpet of thick moss and fallen leaves, soft and silent under their steps. The atmosphere in the forest was oppressive, the air cool and damp, filled with the whisperings of leaves and the distant, mournful calls of crows. Every so often, a branch would snap in the distance, or the rustle of underbrush would suggest they were not alone in their quest. Edgar, his expression grim, urged caution with every step, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. As they ventured deeper, the map led them to an ancient part of the forest known as the Heartwood, a place where the trees were said to be the oldest and the secrets the darkest. The map marked a clearing in the Heartwood where the obsidian crystal was possibly hidden. The journey was slow, hindered by the tangled undergrowth and an increasing sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. Clara, her senses heightened by the danger, noticed a subtle change in the forest's ambience. The usual sounds of wildlife were conspicuously absent here, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. They reached the clearing as the sky began to darken once again, clouds rolling in rapidly as if chasing them. The clearing was a stark contrast to the dense forest, a wide circle of grass that looked unnaturally green and vibrant. In its center stood a single, large stone, its surface smooth and reflective as if polished by centuries of exposure. Edgar approached the stone, his hands trembling slightly. "This is it," he murmured. "The Heart Stone. If the crystal is anywhere, it should be here." They searched around the stone, looking for any signs of disturbance or hidden compartments. As Edgar circled the stone, his foot caught on something partially buried in the ground, a small, metallic object. He bent down, brushing away the dirt and leaves, revealing a small iron box, rusted and worn by time. With effort, Edgar pried open the box. Inside, wrapped in a tattered black cloth, was the obsidian crystal. It was larger than they had expected, its surface gleaming with a dark, almost liquid sheen. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she touched it, the stone cold and somehow pulsating with an energy that felt both ancient and malevolent. As they stood in the clearing, with the crystal finally in their possession, the forest seemed to react. The wind picked up, a low howl that swirled around them, stirring the leaves and whispering in tongues that sounded almost human. The trees bent and twisted, groaning under an unseen force, and from the darkening sky, a single bolt of lightning struck, not far from where they stood. The message was clear: the shadow knew they had found the crystal, and it was angry. Part 6. With the obsidian crystal in hand, Clara and Edgar hurried from the clearing, the oppressive force of the forest urging them onward with a palpable sense of urgency. The sky above was a turmoil of black clouds, swirling ominously as if stirred by an unseen hand. The air was electric, charged with a tension that made their skin tingle and hair stand on end. As they navigated back through the forest, the wind howled louder, branches snapping like the cracks of a whip, forcing them to duck and weave through the natural gauntlet. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. Edgar gripped the crystal tightly, wrapped in the black cloth, its energy pulsing like a dark heart against his palm. The forest seemed unwilling to release them, the paths they followed twisting unexpectedly, looping back on themselves as if the land itself was reshaped by the shadow's will. Time lost meaning under the dense canopy, the light dim and treacherous. They pushed on, driven by a desperation to seal away the shadow before it could gather strength. Finally, they emerged from the forest's grip, the edge of Eldermoor in sight. The village appeared quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath. Dark figures moved at the periphery of their vision, villagers peering from behind curtains, faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They had felt the change, the stirrings of the shadow, the disturbance Clara and Edgar had unwittingly amplified. Reaching Edgar's cottage, they set the crystal on the old wooden table, its surface etched with the scars of many years. Edgar hurriedly pulled out the ancient tome to consult the ritual instructions once more. "We must place the crystal in the very heart of Eldermoor, in the church's foundation. It was built over the original binding site," he explained, his voice tense. The church was old as the village itself, its steeple a broken finger pointing accusingly at the sky. As they approached with the crystal, the air grew colder, the earlier storm now a persistent drizzle that soaked through their clothes, chilling them to the bone. Inside the church, the air was musty, heavy with the scent of old wood and mildew. The pews were empty, the altar bare except for a simple cross. The floor beneath the altar was stone, ancient and worn, the perfect place to reinforce the binding. Clara and Edgar worked quickly to remove the floor stones, revealing a dark cavity beneath. Edgar handed the crystal to Clara, nodding solemnly. "You must be the one to place it. You're the inheritor, tied to this land by blood." With a deep, steadying breath, Clara lowered the crystal into the cavity. As it touched the earth, a shockwave of energy burst forth, knocking them back. The church shook, stones grinding against each other, as if the building itself was in agony. Outside, the skies unleashed a torrential downpour, thunder rolling across the heavens with deafening fury. The ground trembled, and from the forest, a low, menacing growl echoed, a sound of anger and defiance. The shadow was close, its presence almost tangible as the darkness deepened, the day turning to night in a matter of moments. Clara and Edgar, their bodies battered and energy spent, stood by the church door, watching as the village was enveloped in an unnatural darkness. Faces appeared at windows, the villagers' eyes reflecting the terror that gripped their hearts. "We've done what we can," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes locked on the swirling darkness that crept closer from the woods. "Yes," Edgar replied, his hand resting on her shoulder in a meager attempt at reassurance. "Now, we wait." The crystal's energy pulsed beneath the church, a beacon of hope as the shadows converged, the boundary between the worlds thinning. Eldermoor held its breath, the night alive with whispers of the past and the cries of the storm, a chorus of the damned and the saved, intertwined. And in the heart of the village, under the church, the battle for Eldermore's soul began anew, unseen but fiercely felt, a war of light against the dark, silence falling heavy as the world waited for dawn or darkness to claim victory. The end, for now.